Hello, my name is Lauren Garcia, and welcome to my new YouTube channel, Crimson Serenity. Some of you might be familiar with my other channel by my name, Lauren Garcia. I made this second channel dedicated to my New York City Gothic lifestyle because I couldn't figure out how to fit that part of my life into my other channel, being that so many of my subscribers there are not goths. I was going to make my official first video for this new channel about my life history and how I became a goth, but making that video is proving to take a bit longer than what I had hoped for. I will upload that particular video later on when it's done, but in the meantime I instead chose to do a book review for you all as my first official post. If you find that you like this video, please feel free to click like and subscribe. I plan to make many more videos soon for your enjoyment. And now, without further ado, let's get into my Gothic impressions of this great book. This 223-page softcover is called Goth: The Design, Art, and Fashion of a Dark Subculture by Chris Roberts, Hywell Livingstone, and Emma Baxter Wright. The book cost me $19.95 in US dollars at Barnes & Noble here in New York City. But in the back of this softcover, it says it cost $14.99 in pounds for those of you who live in the UK. The synopsis in the back of this edition says, with a long history stretching over hundreds of years of evolution, the Gothic encompasses a distinctive visual aesthetic that is open to endless imaginative reinvention. In Goth, the dark heart of this ever-adaptable subculture is explored in all its many manifestations, including architecture, contemporary art, cult fiction, cinema, rock music, and fashion. From seminal Gothic novels and films like Frankenstein and Dracula, to the music of Bauhaus and The Cure, through the macabre meanderings of Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft, to the current scene, this comprehensive book covers the richly complex genre in all its unearthly glory. Chris Roberts writes on music, film, fiction, and popular culture. He has published books on Heath Ledger, Kate Moss, and Lou Reed, among others. Sculptor and lecturer Hywell Livingstone has a Master in History of Art from Bristol University and has exhibited widely in the UK and in the USA. Emma Baxter Wright is a fashion journalist and author who has contributed to such magazines as The Face and Marie Claire. Now, what drew me to this book was, of course, the striking front cover, with the beautiful Gothic red-headed model and the bold gold medieval writing of the words Goth on it. As soon as you open the softcover, the first image you are introduced with is this amazing haute couture dress that looks like a high-fashion version of something that might have come out of the movie Hellraiser. The next page is the publication information. This book was published by Carlton Books Limited in 2016 in London. I wish I had a better camera so that you can properly see the wallpaper type background used throughout this edition. I don't know if you can see it, but it looks like some sort of dark Byzantine design print. It's quite nice, I like it. The table of contents lists the chapters as being the introduction, architecture, art, fiction, film, music, and fashion. The introduction basically goes into what this Gothic means to people, and what to expect in this conundrum of a book. Then we go into the first chapter called Architecture. It begins to discuss the first example of Gothic architecture called the Royal Abbey of Saint Denis in Paris. The chapter tells the story of the saint that the cathedral is named after, and a bit of the history of how the building came about. And then it proceeds to talk about what makes a Gothic building Gothic. Why did the Mason builders design and construct the buildings the way they did, with their vaults, pillars, stained glass window, and buttresses? The segment also goes on to discuss some of the historical stories about the martyred saints that inspired the commission of these cathedrals. Finally, the chapter goes into late Gothic architecture and Gothic revival architecture. Here they show a small photo of one of the finest Gothic revival in my hometown of New York City, St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's one of my favorite buildings here aside from the cloisters in Upper Manhattan, and it's still a marvel to look at in my opinion. The next part is art. It starts out discussing medieval art and how explorers like Marco Polo and their adventures into far-off foreign lands inspired some of the works. The chapter then tells how the church commissioned art so that illiterate pilgrims who would come to visit their holy sanctum would see what the cost of their sins would be, as well as the rewards of their salvation if they so choose the latter. After, the author proceeds to explain how the Black Death inspired many works of art of the period that depicts the Grim Reaper. When I saw this photo of this painting called The Red Dragon by William Blake, I was racking my brain trying to figure out what movie have I seen this work on. Then it finally dawned on me. It was one of the major plot points of the Silence of the Lambs prequel called The Red Dragon. Silly me, how could I have forgotten that? Finally, the chapter ends on modern Gothic art. I love this sculpture called Black Kite by Gabriel Orozco. It's made from a human skull, and even though it's called Black Kite, it reminds me of a chessboard. It gives me the impression of playing a game with death. I find the artwork so beautifully captivating. This section on modern Gothic art finishes discussing contemporary Gothic artists and their use of theatricality when making stage installations, not just in galleries, but in films as well. Now we come to the section on fiction. I really learned a lot from this chapter. There were so many surprising side notes in this segment of the book that I never knew, plus novels I never heard of that I now am dying to read as a result of me reading this part of the softcover. One of them is the very first Gothic novel called The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. I am ashamed to say I have never heard of it until now, but now it's on my top list of must-read books. The chapter also tells of Anne Radcliffe and her novels as well as Mary Shelley and her famous book Frankenstein. A fascinating side note on Mary Shelley that was mentioned was that she wrote Frankenstein when she was only 18 years old and published at first anonymously 2 years later as Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. The chapter then moves into Victorian Gothic novels. One of the most famous Victorian-era authors they discuss is none other than Edgar Allan Poe, the godfather of Gothic literature, and some of his history. Poe used to write detective novels, some of which Sir Arthur Conan Doyle spoke highly of. And speaking about detective novels, this chapter goes on to talking more about that very subject and some of the very first mystery books on the matter. Next come Gothic giants, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and of course Dracula. You can't discuss Gothic literature without mentioning Dracula. Finally, they move on to modern writings and begin to talk about American Gothic works, British Gothic fiction, and mainstream books. And now film is the next chapter. Here the author writes about not only the film versions of Gothic novels, but the real-life influences that inspire the movies to be made, like War, for example. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is considered by many people to be what started the Gothic cinema, even though a German movie from 1913 called The Students of Prague, also known as A Bargain with Satan, was one of the first. Gollum? No, not the nasty jewelry-obsessed guy from The Lord of the Rings. Gollum, the Jewish fable, was made into a film in 1920. It was like a clay Frankenstein monster that was meant to protect and defend the Jews until it went awry. The segment also talks about Nosferatu and how Bela Lugosi's Dracula was influenced by that movie. Even Gothic elitists would be happy to hear that Nosferatu was filmed all across Eastern Europe, including in Transylvania, close to the real-life castle of the actual Vlad Dracula. The old dark house invented the classic film genre of people taking shelter in a spooky house during a dark and stormy night and meeting a creepy and unsettling family. The movie led to the creation of certain types of building, like those in the film Psycho and The Shining. This is my favorite movie image, the Bride of Frankenstein. I even made a Halloween costume of this character for a high school costume contest back in the 1980s. Looking at this photo is making me want to make this outfit again and cosplay as her for Comic-Con. I really can't get enough of the look. Schlock horror came in with the new age of color films. The more splattering of crimson blood, the more the viewers loved it. Psychological trauma flicks of the 1960s gave birth to classic horror movies of that time, like The Innocent, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Mask of the Red Death, and Rosemary's Baby. Then in the 70s began the move into mainstream cinema, with movies like The Exorcist, which was the first horror movie to be nominated for Best Picture Oscar, The Omen, and The Shining. Glossy Gothic came with the 80s, my teen years. I remember going to theater to see The Howling when it first came out. In fact, I have seen many of the films in this particular decade that was mentioned in this book. This section talks about how special effects advanced and became more elaborate. The author goes on to discuss flashy films like The Hunger that actually starred David Bowie as a vampire. The on-screen soundtrack even played Bauhaus's Bela Lugosi's Dead. Now I remember when the costumes for the movie Bram Stoker's Dracula were on display in the windows of Macy's. I was a college student at the Fashion Institute of Technology here in New York City, and I fell madly in love with the outfits long before I ever became a goth. Now you can't talk about Gothic cinema without uttering the name Tim Burton. And of course, the author of this chapter did not fail to do just that. It wouldn't be complete without mentioning his Gothic cinematic creations, including his version of Batman. Talking about Batman, Chris Nolan's Dark Knight version is also discussed as well. The Blair Witch Project was a phenomenon that invented the low-budget camcorder blog method of filming. A side note, my brother took courses at the Film Institute here in New York City and attended classes of one of the directors of this psychological horror flick. The movie was made with only $60,000 US and grossed $248.6 million at the box office. The chapter later moves on to talking about Gothic TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, True Blood, and American Horror Story, just to name a few. Then the segment finally ends on art films like Black Swan and The Woman in Black, for example. Music starts out talking about how many can argue about when did Gothic music began. Many can say it started with the post-punk era and the Batcave nightclub scene, but some would say it went further back than the late 70s or early 80s. Some might argue it went as far back as the heavy metal band Black Sabbath. Others might say as far back as the Doors, and then some would say Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, or, my favorite, Carl Orff's Carmina Burana. This book considers the start of Gothic music as a gray area, rather than jet black as they called it. After the introduction of the music section in this softcover, they begin to talk about some of the bands and their music that influenced the Gothic sound and scene. They start out with the famous heavy metal band Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath not only was one of the major bands that began the new heavy metal genre, but arguably had a big influence on goth music due to its dark macabre theme lyrics and sound. The author then wrote 3 pages on Lou Reed and his band The Velvet Underground. The Velvet Underground's album Berlin is a rock opera complete with storytelling of a tragic and doomed love story. Another major influencer of Gothic music is Alice Cooper. Though he is the godfather of what is called shock rock, it's his look and dark horror movie style stage performance that left such an imprint on Gothic music. Nightclubbing actually refers to a track that was covered by Susie Sue with the band The Creatures. Then later, the song was sampled by Trent Reznor for the 1994 album Closer. This segment then starts to talk about Iggy Pop and his debut album that was produced by David Bowie called The Idiot. Finally, the author begins to discuss Joy Division and refers to them as the first band to be described as Gothic. At last, we get into the group that was actually labeled as Gothic rock or goth band, Bauhaus. This section covers Peter Murphy's interview that he did before he was arrested in Los Angeles in 2013. In the interview, he is quoted as saying, "We were original, we were glam, we were beautiful." It also covers interview with other members of the iconic band as well. Spellbound is about Susie and the Banshees and their numerous albums and songs. Later in the softcover, the author of this chapter moves on to the 90s with commercially successful mega superstars like Marilyn Manson and 9 Inch Nails. Finally, the chapter ends with modern Gothic music in the 21st century with the label of post-Gothic music. Fashion. I have a degree in fashion design and a second degree in accessories design from the Fashion Institute of Technology here in New York City, so you can imagine how much this next chapter interested me the most. Fashion Introduction discusses the looks of goth and about how Gothic fashion is not exclusive to any generation or geographical location. The author then talks about the origins of Gothic design and how the Batcave in London during the 1980s created and influenced the style as well. She wrote about not just how the music scene impacted the Gothic vogue of the times, but how films did as well. It's not uncommon for fashion to find inspiration from historical costumes. There is never anything new under the sun. When I was a student at the fashion college that I graduated from, it was mandatory for fashion students to take a class called Fashion Past and Present. We studied fashion history and used those ancient designs as inspirations for our class projects. So taking images from the past and using them to create a current look is the norm in the industry. Historical Fashion Influences section talks about how a lot of the current Gothic designs are heavily based upon historical outfits. For the gentleman, the flamboyant dandy discusses men's Gothic Vogue inspirations and how historical figures like the late Lord Byron, for example, and his flamboyant dandy attire inspired modern designer when they create Gothic menswear. Iconic Goths covers famous Gothic icons throughout history that has proven to be a huge impactors on Gothic fashion to this day. Goth Styles from High Street to Haute Couture is a segment that discusses how Gothic mode moves into high fashion and the beautifully dramatic results. It mentions many couturiers and their interpretation of the macabre style. Gothic Mutation talks about how Gothic designs branched out into various subgenres like cybergoth, Gothic Lolitas, and fetish goth, just to name a few. A happy side note that I am compelled to mention here. I posted a status on Facebook about this book. One of the people in this picture in page 210 tagged himself and his friend who he is posing with in this picture when I uploaded this picture. Now he's on my friends list. Goth The Design, Art, and Fashion of the Dark Subculture ends abruptly with photos from the Whitby Gothic Weekend Festival event. This softcover book is full of delicious, beautifully unearthly images. This edition is easy to read and is full of information that many Goths might like to educate themselves with. It's also great for baby bats to learn more about our subculture and its history, plus how it began and where it all came from. Moreover, it's a great book for non-Goths who might be curious and would like to know what the Goth scene is all about. Now, with that said, there are a tiny few things that I can't help but criticize about in this book. In the architecture chapter, though they do a great job explaining the history of Gothic buildings and about what makes a Gothic architecture with its vaults and stained glass windows, they fail to mention gargoyles as one of its parts. Gargoyles are some of the most interesting and popular parts of Gothic architecture. Not only were some used to ward off evil spirits, but they were mainly used for functional reasons, like dividing the flow of rainwater off of the buildings to prevent erosion. To this day, many buildings still use decorative statues and reliefs to siphon off rainwater. Though I understand that there is no way one could possibly cover every Gothic artist in the art segment, but I am still very surprised that H.R. Giger was never mentioned. His work was the major inspiration for the Alien movie franchise. Without H.R. Giger's Xenomorph, there is no Ridley Scott's Alien. The popularity of the film and the artworks by Giger has even influenced furniture designers, fashion designers, and even vehicle manufacturers to create one-of-a-kind dystopian sci-fi inspired items. The H.R. Giger book I am showing here is one that I bought back in the 1990s, but the original publication was in 1984 by Morpheus International Books. Fiction was the most educating chapter for me. I learned about many novels that I personally never heard of that are now on my bucket list of must-read. But I can't see how you can have a section on Gothic detective novels and not talk about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his famous Sherlock Holmes series. The author's name is mentioned several times in this chapter, but the book never discusses the popular Gothic detective stories that were written during the Victorian era. Music starts out fine. I even agree with the writer when he mentions how the beginnings of Gothic music are a gray area. I can even appreciate some of the examples of what he considers influencers of Gothic music. But he dedicated 3 pages worth on Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, while only using 1 to 2 pages on major goth bands like Bauhaus and Susie and the Banshees. Plus, even though he mentioned the late David Bowie in passing, he never goes into discussing the inspiring artist and his impactful music, fashion, and stage performances. I was looking most forward to the Gothic Fashion chapter, and for the most part it didn't disappoint me, except when it came to showing some of the examples of couture outfits of famous high fashion designers. The author chose to show this Givenchy design as a sample of Gothic haute couture, but I hardly consider it goth, even though this designer had in the past created far more darker Gothic looks. In fact, though most of the photos that were used of other designers' works I find to be great, I still think there were plenty of runway images that the writer could have picked from, that could have been used as prime examples of the dark fashion. There is no lacking of photos of the macabre haute couture vogue in the internet. So again, Goth, the design, art, and fashion of a dark subculture, published by Conundrum Books, cost me only $19.95 at Barnes & Noble here in New York City, but it is also marked as $14.99 in pounds. Overall, despite my few complaints, I still loved this book. I found it to be highly informative and most entertaining as well. Some of the photos are amazing and beautiful. The edition not only brought back many good memories, it exposed me to many things I had no idea about. I didn't even cover all of the segments and showed you all of the images in this book, so there is still much to see and read. I highly recommend it, and I would consider it a must-buy for your Gothic book collection. So from a rating of 1 to 5, I give this Goth book 4 flying bats. Just about almost perfect for any goth, especially baby bats, who want to educate themselves about the subculture they are venturing into. Hope you enjoyed my Gothic Impressions book review of Goth, the Design, Art, and Fashion of a Dark Subculture by Chris Roberts, Hywell Livingstone, and Emma Baxter Wright, published by Conundrum Books. Remember to like this video, and if you haven't done so already, please feel free to subscribe to my Crimson Serenity YouTube channel. I will be adding more videos soon in the coming weeks, and will be adding them more on a regular basis. You can also find me at my other channel, Lauren Garcia. I will add the link below for your convenience. Please feel free to like my videos there and subscribe if you enjoy them as well. So until next time, may all of your Gothic wishes come true. See you later, my Crimson Rosebuds. Goodbye, adieu, ciao, and adios.